All right, think bee stings, think Indians, think honey. Does that remind you of what happened the last time? So today, chapter 6 and 7. Finally, Matt woke and knew that he was well. His body was no longer on fire. He could open his eyes, and he saw that sunlight glinted through the chinks in the roof. All his familiar things were around him, the shelves with the pewter dishes, his jacket hanging on a peg. He felt as though he had been on a long journey and had finally come home. He must have slept through half a day and a night. When the cabin door opened and the Indian entered, Matt hastily pulled himself up. Now, with clear eyes, he saw that there was nothing in the least strange about this man. He was dressed not so differently from Matt's own father, in a coat of some rough brown cloth and leggings fringed down the side. His face was smooth-shaven, and so was his whole head, except for one long black top-knot. When he saw that Matt was awake, his stern face was lighted by a wide smile. "Good." It was half word, half grunt. "White boy very sick. Now well." Matt remembered his father's advice. "Good morning," he said respectfully. The Indian pointed at his hand at his own chest. "Sackness, family of Beaver," he said. He seemed to be waiting. "I'm Matthew Hallowell," Matt answered. "Good. White man leave you here?" "Just for a while," Matt told him. "He has gone to get my mother." It did not occur to him to lie to this old man as he had to Ben. Moreover, he knew that there was something he had to say. He tried to find the right words. "I'm grateful to you," he said finally. "It was a very lucky thing you happened to find me." "We watch. White boy very foolish to climb bee tree." So he had been right, Matt thought, that eyes were watching him from the forest. He was sure that the Indian had not asked him where he lived. They had brought him straight home to this cabin, even though he knew it was his good fortune they'd been watching him yesterday. He still felt somewhat resentful of their spying. Abruptly, he swung his feet to the floor and winced as a sharp pain ran up his leg. The Indian noticed, and moving closer, he took Matt's ankle between his hands and gently pressed it with his fingers. "Is it broken?" Matt asked. "No, not broke. Mend soon. Sleep now. Not need medicine more." The Indian had put something on the table as he came in. When he had gone, Matt hobbled over to see what it was, and found a wooden bowl of stew, thick and greasy, flavored with some strange plant, wonderfully filling and strengthening. With it there was a cake of cornbread, coarser than his own, but delicious. The next day the Indian brought the boy with him. "Niquinis, you call grandson. Atian." The two boys stared at each other. The Indian boy's black eyes held no expression whatsoever. Unlike the old man, he wore nothing except for the breechcloth held up by a string at his waist. It passed between his legs and hung down like a little apron in the front and the back. His heavy black hair fell straight to his shoulders. "Atian same winter as white boy, maybe?" the man asked. He held up 10 fingers and then 4 more. "I'm 13, Matt answered, holding up his own fingers. At least he excused himself. That would be true in another week. The Indian boy did not speak a word. Quite plainly, he had been brought here against his will. He stared about the cabin and seemed to despise everything he saw. He made Matt feel like a fool, sitting with his leg propped up on a stool. Matt steadied himself on his good leg and stood up. Now he noticed that Sackness was holding out to him, a rough sort of crutch. Matt wished he did not have to try it right now with both of them watching him, but he could see that the man expected it. He managed a few steps, furious at his own clumsiness. He had never imagined how pesky a crutch could be. Moreover, although there was not the slightest change in the boy's face, Matt was sure that Etienne was laughing at him. There was a nasty little gleam in the boy's eye. The moment they were gone, he seized the crutch in earnest, and very soon he could swing himself along at a good brisk pace. Now he was able to get about outside the cabin, to check the corn patch, and to bring in firewood. The trouble was, he had only one boot. The woolen stocking his mother had knit for him was wearing thin. On the rough ground, it wore through in no time. This, too, the Indian noticed when he came with his grandson next morning. "No boot," he said, pointing. I lost it, Matt answered. It came off in the mud when I ran. Once again, he felt ridiculous under the Indian boy's black eye stare. 3 days later, Sackness brought him a pair of moccasins. They were handsome and new, of moose hide, dark and glistening with grease, tied with stout strings that were strong enough to wrap around his ankles. Beaver woman make, Sackness said. Better white man's boot. White boy see. Matt took off his one boot and slipped on the moccasins. Indeed, they were better. In fact, they were wonderful. Not stiff like new leather boots, not knobby or pinchy anywhere. Light as nothing at all when he lifted his feet. No wonder Indians did not make a sound when they walked in the forest. Shame suddenly flooded over Matt. This man had perhaps saved his life, had come bringing food and a crutch, and now these beautiful moccasins. It wasn't enough just to say an awkward thank you. He needed to give something in return. Not money. There was a few silver coins in the tin box, but something made him very sure that he could not offer money to this proud old man. He looked about him in despair. There was also almost nothing of his own in the cabin. Then he spied the 2 books on the shelf, the only 2 his father had been able to carry into the wilderness. One was the Bible. He dared not give away his father's Bible. The other book was his own, the only one he had ever possessed, Robinson Crusoe. He had read it a dozen times and thought of parting with it was painful, but it was the only thing he had to give. He hobbled across the room and took it down from the shelf and held it out to the Indian. Sackness stared at it. It's for you, Matt said. It's a gift. Please take it. Sackness reached out and took the book in his hand. He turned it over and over slowly, his face showing not a sign of pleasure. Then he opened it and stood peering at the page. With shame, Matt saw that he was holding it upside down. He couldn't read. Of course he couldn't. Matt should have known that. He had made a terrible mistake and embarrassed the good old man. He had heard once that the one thing an Indian could never forgive was a hurt to his pride. He felt his own face burning. But Sackness did not look embarrassed. His dark stare went from the book to Matt's face. White boy no signs? He asked. Matt was puzzled. White boy read, will white man write here? Yes, Matt admitted, I can read. For a long moment the Indian studied the book. Then, astonishingly, that rare white smile flashed. Good. Sackness make treaty. A treaty? Matt was even more puzzled. Niquennis hunt. Bring white boy bird and rabbit. White boy teach Atian white man signs. You mean I should teach him to read? Good. White boy teach Atian what books say. Doubtfully, Matt looked from the old man to the boy, who stood silently listening. His heart sank. The scorn in the boy's face had turned to black anger. Nada! The furious word exploded, the first word Matt had ever heard Atian speak. Half under his breath, he muttered a string of incomprehensible words. His grandfather's stern face did not change. He was undisturbed by the boy's defiance. Atian learn, he said. White man come more and more to Indian land. White man not make treaty with pipe. White man make signs on paper. Signs Indian not know. Indian put mark on paper to show him friend of white man. Then white man take land. Tell Indian cannot hunt on land. Atian learn to read white man signs. Atian not give away hunting grounds. The boy glowered at his grandfather, but he did not dare to speak again. With a black scowl, he stalked out of the cabin. Good, Sackness said calmly. He handed the book back to Matt. Atian come Siba tomorrow. Before he had his eyes open the next morning, Matt knew that something was wrong with this day. When it came back to him, he sat up with a groan. Atian! What had possessed him to give a book to an Indian? How could he possibly teach the savage to read? He tried to think back to the time his mother had taught him his ABCs. He could plainly see that brown-covered primer she held in her hands. He had detested it. He had to learn short phrases printed inside each letter. A. In Adam's fall, we sinned all. That would hardly do. To be honest, he wasn't sure to this day just what it meant. He would feel mighty silly trying to explain it to a heathen. Then happily he recalled another book that had been sent to his sister, Sarah, from England, with a small picture to illustrate each letter. No nonsense about Adam. A was for apple. Sarah had been luckier than he was. But he had no way of making pictures, and there were no apples here in the forest. What could he find for A that an Indian would understand? He looked about the cabin. T is for table, but it was unlikely he'd ever get as far as T. How about A for arm? That was simple enough. B. His eye fell on the leg bone of the squirrel left from last night's meal. The stub of a candle would do for C. D. Door would be just the word for Etienne. He certainly could walk out one fast enough, and would again, no doubt, long before they got to D. He doubted that Etienne would come. Still, he had better be ready. He stirred the fire, ate a chunk of cold Indian corn cake, and set about to prepare his schoolroom. He shoved the 2 stools together and laid Robinson Crusoe on the table. He did not have paper or ink. He found a ribbon of birch bark in a corner and tore off a strip and sharpened a stick to a point. And then he waited. Etienne came swinging a dead rabbit by the ears. He slung it disdainfully on the table. "Thank you," Matt said. "That's a big one. I won't need anything else for several days." His politeness brought no response. "Sit here," he ordered. He hesitated. "I never thought as how I'd have to teach anyone to read, but I have figured out a way to start." Silently, the boy sat down as straight and rigid as a cedar post. When Matt hunched himself onto the other stool, the boy's scowl deepened. Plainly, he did not like having the white boy so close to him. Etienne had no need to be finicky, Matt thought. He smelled none too sweet himself. The grease smeared on his body, even on his hair, stunk up the whole cabin. It was supposed to keep off the mosquitoes he'd heard, but he thought he'd rather have the pesky insects himself. He drew a letter on the birch bark. "This is the first letter," he explained. A. A for arm. He repeated this several times, pointing to his own arm. Etienne kept to his stubborn, scornful silence. Matt set his jaw. He could be stubborn too, he decided. He opened Robinson Crusoe. "We'll pick out the A's on this page," he said, trying to control his impatience. "Now, you show me one." Etienne stared straight ahead of him in silence. Then, to Matt's astonishment, he grudgingly laid a grubby finger on a letter A. "Good," said Matt, copying the word Sackness used too often. "Find another." Suddenly, the boy broke his silence. "White man's book foolish," he scoffed. "Write arm, arm, arm all over paper." Puzzled at first, Matt saw his own mistake. "Hundreds of other letters begin with A," he explained, "or have an A in them. And there are 25 more letters." "How long?" Etienne scowled. "What do you mean?" "How long Etienne learned signs in book?" "Well, it will take some time," Matt said. "There are a lot of long words in this book." "1 moon?" "1 month? Of course not. It might take a year." With one swift jerk of his arm, Etienne knocked the book from the table. Before Matt could speak, he was out of the cabin and gone. "Reckon that's the end of the lessons," Matt said to himself. Cheerfully, he began to skin the rabbit. So think about if you had to teach somebody how to read or how to do something. How would you do that? So I want you to think about our main characters so far. We have Matt, who is the 12, almost 13-year-old boy. We have Sackness, who is the Indian grandfather. And we have Etienne, who's kind of a grumpy 14-year-old boy. His grandfather wants him to learn how to read so that they can make agreements with the white people and not lose their land. So we are through chapter 7.